My name is Linda Parks. I'm 68 years old. And what I'm about to share with you isn't just a story, it's the kind of truth that leaves a mark. I gave everything I had, my love, my time, my future to the boy I raised as my own son. And in the middle of what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life, he erased me. The moment still plays back in my head like a slow-motion scene I can't turn off. It was his wedding day. The music softened. Champagne glasses clinked. And he stood there in his custom tuxedo, glowing, holding the microphone. My heart was pounding just for a moment. I thought he'd say my name. I thought maybe, finally, he'd see me. Instead, he turned to another woman. And with that confident smile I used to know so well, he thanked her, called her his real mother. Right there, in front of 200 people, and I just sat there quiet, frozen, smiling on the outside, while something deep inside me cracked wide open. I'd spent nearly 4 decades giving my all for him. So how did I end up invisible in his story? If you're still with me, thank you. Because to understand how I got to that moment, I need to take you back to a rainy afternoon in 1982. The day that changed my life forever. That's where it all began. It was a cold, gray afternoon in March of 1982, the kind of day where the rain just doesn't stop. And the sky feels heavier than usual. I still remember the sound of my work shoes squishing against the hospital floor, soaked through from my walk across the parking lot. My feet ached. My scrubs were damp. And I was exhausted from another double shift. I was 25 then, a young nurse, still trying to figure out my place in the world. Living alone in a 1-bedroom apartment just outside of Cincinnati. I didn't have much, but I got by. I had dreams, though small, practical ones. Maybe saving up for a car that didn't stall at red lights. Maybe a weekend trip one day, somewhere with sunshine. That all disappeared the moment the phone rang. The voice on the other end was trembling. I didn't even have to hear the whole sentence to know something was wrong. My younger sister, Angela, and her husband had been in a car accident. They didn't make it. I dropped the phone. I don't even remember locking up the hospital or grabbing my coat. All I remember is running. And when I got to the emergency room, I saw him 5 years old. Tiny. Hunched over on the edge of a gurney. His cheeks were streaked with dried tears and soot. And his hands were clenched so tightly they turned red. His name was Michael. He kept whispering the word mommy, over and over, like he was trying to call her back. I didn't wait for anyone to ask me. The social worker barely got the words out, "Would you be willing to take him in for now?" before I answered. It wasn't a decision. It was instinct. I picked him up, held him in my arms, and felt something shift inside me. That night, we slept on my old couch. He curled into a ball against me. And when his breathing finally slowed, I looked down at his face and knew this wasn't temporary. I had no one else. And I couldn't imagine handing him off to a stranger. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have savings. But I had love. And somehow, I thought that would be enough. Raising Michael was like learning to swim in the deep end while carrying someone else on your back. I was clumsy. I messed up more times than I could count. There were nights when he cried for his mom and I cried in the bathroom, hoping he wouldn't hear. I worked days at the hospital and nights at the senior care center across town. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. I skipped haircuts, canceled dates, and sold my record collection just to pay for preschool. Love wasn't convenient, but it was constant. And on the days I couldn't afford birthday gifts, I got creative. I built cardboard castles from leftover boxes. I hand-sewed a Batman costume from one of my old uniforms. It wasn't perfect. But the way his eyes lit up, I would have done it all again. He called me Aunt Linda. Always had. I used to think, someday he'll understand, that what I gave up wasn't a burden, it was a choice. A loving one. But I never pushed. I just kept showing up, day after day, hoping he felt what I was trying to give. And honestly, for a while, I think he did. There were moments, quiet little ones, when he'd fall asleep in my lap after a nightmare. Or when he'd grab my hand crossing the street without thinking. Those were the moments I held on to. I didn't need grand gestures. I didn't need to be called mom if he wasn't ready. What I needed was to know that my love was enough. But the truth is, I was loving him the best way I knew how, while slowly erasing myself from everything else. And I wouldn't realize the cost of that until much, much later. Because as Michael grew, so did the space between us. And that's what I'll share with you next. As the years passed, Michael grew taller, stronger, more independent, and little by little, he started slipping away from me. It didn't happen overnight. It was slow, almost invisible at first. Like a quiet drift you only notice when you finally look up and realize the distance has become a canyon. He was a teenager now. He stopped asking for help with homework, stopped sitting beside me on the couch during old movies. He started locking his door. I told myself it was normal, just growing pains. Just a boy figuring himself out. Every mother tells herself that when her child starts pulling away. But deep down, something didn't feel normal. There was a coldness that hadn't been there before. A kind of distance that wasn't about age, but about something unspoken. When he was 18, I decided it was time he knew everything. The truth about his parents. The accident. The night I brought him home. I thought it would give him peace to know he was chosen. Not abandoned. That he had been loved every single day since that moment. But what I got instead was silence. The kind that makes you wish you hadn't said a word. He just nodded. Like I'd told him what time it was. Not something that had defined both of our lives. There was no question. No hug. Not even a glance that said he understood. That night, after he went upstairs, I sat at the kitchen table and told myself it was just his age. That boys don't always know how to show emotion. But a part of me knew something between us had cracked. He stopped calling me Aunt Linda after that. But he didn't call me Mom either. It was as if naming me had become too complicated. Too uncomfortable. I became the background, the person who made things happen. Who kept the lights on. Who stayed quiet. When he started college, I barely heard from him. I checked my phone constantly, waiting for a text, an update, anything. Sometimes I'd see his name pop up on social media, smiling with friends I didn't know, in places I'd never been. I'd tell myself he was happy, and that should be enough. But happiness shouldn't feel like loneliness for the person who gave it all. It's funny when you love someone completely. You stop noticing the small ways you disappear. Until one day, you're gone entirely. And they don't even realize you ever stood there. And that's how it was with Michael. My love didn't fade. It just lost its reflection. Still, I kept going. I kept believing time would fix what silence had built. But time doesn't fix everything. Especially when someone new enters the picture, someone who looks at you and decides you don't belong anymore. That's where the story really begins to change. Then she came into his life, Emily. I remember the first time I met her. She walked into my small apartment like she already knew every step of the place. Her posture perfect. Her smile polite but distant. I made the chicken pot pie Michael had loved since he was little, hoping to offer a small taste of home. Something familiar, but she barely touched it, politely declining with a kind of elegance that felt like a door closing. I told myself not to judge. Maybe she needed time to warm up. But over the months, I noticed the subtle changes, the small gestures that gradually pushed me out. Michael started listening to her more than me. He began disappearing for dinner plans, family chores, things he used to include me in. The invitations to events shrank. Conversations became shorter. Calls less frequent. I realized slowly, painfully, that I was no longer part of his world in the same way. I was a guest. A convenience. Someone expected to show up quietly and disappear again. I watched them together. Laughing. Planning. Living the life I had built him into. Without a word to me. Emily didn't need me. And Michael, he was starting to forget he ever did. I told myself it was normal. That love sometimes meant letting go. But it wasn't letting go. It was being erased. And I couldn't help but feel the sting every time I realized I wasn't invited to something small, a brunch, a shopping trip, a conversation that mattered. I tried to stay present, offering help where I could, smiling through polite acknowledgement, reminding myself that being present, even quietly, was a form of love. Yet the truth was undeniable. I was invisible in the life I had raised him for, and the worst part was knowing that this wasn't an accident. It was deliberate in its own quiet way. I was being replaced, step by step, by someone who arrived later. Someone who didn't have to fight through sleepless nights or skipped birthdays. Someone who didn't know what it was like to sacrifice everything for love. It hurt. Deeply. But at the same time, I held on to the memories that no one could take away, the nights I sang him to sleep. The mornings I carried him through fevers. The years I gave to make sure he had something stable to hold on to. Still, I knew that the hardest test was coming, the moment where all of that sacrifice would meet reality in the harshest way possible. And it happened faster than I ever expected. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Michael walked into my kitchen. The house smelled like fresh bread I had baked that morning. And I was folding laundry, lost in the rhythm of a life that had become routine. He looked at me with that same confident air he always carried. The one I used to find charming when he was a boy. But now, it felt distant. Almost foreign. He asked for help with the wedding. Not a small favor. Not something simple. $2,000, no. $20,000 for the venue. The decorations. The wedding that would mark the start of a new chapter in his life. I froze. I could feel the weight of it in my chest. This wasn't just money. This was my life savings. The emergency fund I had painstakingly built over decades, safety nets for myself. Little pockets of freedom I allowed myself after years of giving everything away. And suddenly, all of it was expected. Taken for granted. I remembered all the nights I stayed awake, nursing him through fevers. All the mornings I sacrificed sleep to make breakfast. To make sure he started the day right. All the times I put aside my own dreams. My own comfort. So he could have a life I barely had. And now, he came to me like it was nothing. Like it was owed. I told myself to breathe. To remain calm. I told myself that love didn't always come with gratitude. And maybe this was just another phase. But the sting was sharp. I took a day to think. I went over my finances. My options. The small hope that I could say no without breaking the fragile bond that still existed. And in the quiet of the morning, I made my choice. I withdrew the full amount. I placed it carefully in an envelope. As if doing so could soften the blow. As if order could turn sacrifice into something bearable. I left it on the porch. I didn't call him. I didn't text him. I just left it there and walked back inside, pretending not to notice the silence. I wanted him to take it. To carry on. To make his wedding day perfect without needing me to be anything more than the source of money he assumed I always would be. And yet, as I closed the door, I realized something I hadn't acknowledged before. This wasn't about money. It was about recognition. About love. About being seen. I wondered then, quietly, as I watched him leave with Emily beside him, whether he would ever understand the depth of what it cost me to raise him. And if he did, would it matter? At that point I told myself that day, in that quiet kitchen, that I would no longer let my love be taken for granted. That something inside me had to change. Little did I know that the hardest, most heartbreaking moment, the wedding itself was only a few weeks away, and it would test everything I thought I knew about love, sacrifice, and the meaning of being a mother. The wedding day arrived, and the ballroom took my breath away. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen stars, reflecting soft light on tables that glimmered with glassware and pastel flowers. A live jazz trio played softly, barely audible over the hum of guests laughing, greeting, and taking photos. Michael looked like a movie star in his tuxedo, confident, radiant. Emily was beside him, glowing, perfectly composed, every gesture deliberate. I stayed at a table near the back, where I wouldn't be in the way. My place card had my name on it, slightly misspelled, and I noticed it immediately. I smiled to myself, quietly, because it didn't matter what anyone else saw. I knew who I was and why I was there. The speeches began. Emily's mother went first, eyes glistening with tears as she praised their love, spoke of family, of pride, of dreams realized. I nodded along, hiding my own thoughts. I wasn't there to compete. I just wanted to be present. Then the moment came. The music paused. Conversation quieted. Michael stood and took the microphone. My heart raced. Maybe he'd say something. Anything. To me, maybe he'd finally see the years, the nights, the sacrifices. But he didn't. He spoke of a woman who had been his rock, his guide, his real mother, and he called her Emily's mom. He thanked her for everything, for her warmth, her love, her presence. Time slowed. I felt a knot in my throat, a weight pressing down on my chest. People glanced at me briefly, then looked away, unsure of what to say. I didn't cry. I didn't protest. I just sat there, breathing carefully, keeping my face serene. Some pains burn quietly, in silence, and this was one of them. I watched the first dance. Michael spun Emily lightly, their eyes locked, shining with joy and excitement, and I felt a bitter ache. This wasn't oversight. It was the portrait of the man he had become. The child I held through nights of fever and tears was gone, replaced by someone who didn't need me anymore. I remembered the early days. The rainy afternoon when I brought him home. 5 years old. Frightened. Alone. The nights of sewing costumes. Of building cardboard castles. Of working double shifts to make ends meet. And now, all that effort, all that love, seemed invisible, erased by a single sentence. The applause rang around me, but I felt like I was behind glass, watching a life I had nurtured unfold without me. I thought of all the small ways I had disappeared over the years, of the ways I had put his happiness above my own, and how that had cost me my place in his heart. And yet, even in the depths of that humiliation, a small spark inside me began to stir. I realized something important. Love doesn't mean losing yourself. And while he may not have seen me that day, I was still there. I was still strong. I was still whole in ways he would never understand. As I left the ballroom that night, I didn't feel defeated. I felt a quiet determination. The first stirrings of reclaiming the part of myself I had lost in raising someone else. I knew the next steps wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had a choice. And that choice would lead me to a path I hadn't expected. One that would transform my life entirely. Because sometimes, the most painful moments are the ones that awaken the strength you didn't know you had. And that's where my story takes its next turn. That night, after the wedding, I went home alone. The ballroom lights, the music, the laughter, the applause. It all felt like someone else's life. A story I had written, but no longer inhabited. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't even take off my shoes. I just sat on the edge of the bed in the coral dress I had carefully chosen. The one that was meant to make me feel seen. And yet, I hadn't felt more invisible in years. I opened an old closet. The one I rarely touched. There, beneath old blankets and forgotten boxes, I was a folder I hadn't opened in decades. Inside were the papers I had kept quietly over the years: contracts, bank statements, receipts, and the deed to a piece of land my father had bought when I was a child. I remembered how he used to say that preparedness mattered more than words. That sometimes you don't need to announce your worth, you just have to protect it quietly. And that night, for the first time in a long time, I realized I had been living as if my value was tied to Michael's recognition, waiting for a thank you that would never come. I had given everything of myself, and in doing so, I had forgotten to see myself. I started thinking about the years of sacrifices, the nights sewing costumes, the mornings tending fevers, the tiny victories and memories I had made for him. I had raised him. I had loved him fiercely. But I had also allowed my identity to shrink, to disappear in service to someone else's life. I knew something had to change. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but because I deserved to exist fully, to acknowledge the woman I had become. I wasn't a secondary character in my own story anymore. I made a plan quietly that night. I would no longer let my love be assumed or exploited. I would reclaim my life, my space, my peace. I would build something that reflected who I was and what I had endured, not for recognition, but because it was time I finally honored myself. It wasn't easy to admit how much I had lost along the way. The small ways I had been erased. The moments I had ignored in favor of him. But acknowledging it was the first step. And that acknowledgement, though painful, felt strangely freeing. I understood. Finally. That strength didn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispered in quiet moments like this one, reminding you that you are still here, that you still matter. And that whisper became the foundation for the next chapter of my life, the chapter where I would stop disappearing and start standing firmly in my own story. Because sometimes, being invisible is the very thing that teaches you the value of being seen. And the next part of my journey would prove that lesson in ways I had never imagined. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I realized that no apology, no gratitude, no moment of recognition from Michael would restore what I had silently given. My love had been constant, but his acknowledgement had been absent, and that absence had cost me more than I could bear. I knew what I had to do, not out of anger, not to punish him, but to reclaim the part of myself I had given away too freely. I contacted my attorney quietly, without fanfare, and arranged to revise my will. Every asset, every account, every benefit that had once been designated for Michael was removed. In its place, I decided to establish a small foundation, dedicated to women who had given everything for their families, who had worked tirelessly and often silently, and who deserved recognition, dignity, and support. I felt a sense of calm as I signed the papers. No tears, no dramatic confrontations, just certainty. For the first time, I wasn't living for someone else's approval. I was living for me, and for the women who, like me, had carried the weight of love without applause. When Michael and Emily came by later, expecting to find the same version of me who had always provided, they were met with a woman who was present, firm, and unshakable. I didn't have to explain myself. I didn't need to justify why the changes had been made. My presence, my silence, and the quiet confidence in my actions spoke louder than any words could. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades: freedom. Not the fleeting kind, but a deep, rooted sense of self-worth. I had learned that love should never cost you your own existence. And sometimes, the most important people you need to protect are yourself and your own story. Little did I know, this decision would not only redefine my life, but would also lead to the reckoning I had been silently awaiting. And that reckoning was about to arrive in ways I never could have predicted. After I made the changes, Michael and Emily came to my door. I could feel their unease the moment they stepped inside. The house looked different to them, though I hadn't changed a thing. It wasn't the walls, or the furniture, or the view. It was me. I was no longer the invisible mother they assumed would always be present. Silently giving, silently accepting. I was here, fully myself, unshakable, and they weren't sure how to respond. Michael scanned the room, eyes flicking over objects he had helped me arrange years ago. The paintings I chose without worrying if they matched anyone else's taste. The spaces I had curated for my life, not his. And for the first time, I saw confusion in his face. I realized then that he had never truly understood what I had built for us. For him. Silently. Over decades. Emily hovered nearby. Unsure where to stand. Unsure what to say. I understood. They had expected the same version of me who had always stepped aside, who had always let their needs and desires take priority. And now? That version of me was gone. I let them stand there for a while, taking it in. I didn't rush to fill the silence. Didn't offer explanations. The quiet was necessary. They needed to recognize, without words from me, that the foundation of our past had shifted. I thought about all those years of giving without acknowledgement, of fading into the background for the sake of their comfort. And I realized that this moment, though uncomfortable for them, was exactly what I had been waiting for. Recognition wasn't about their gratitude, it was about my own awareness of who I was and what I had accomplished. And so, I waited. I let the silence stretch long enough for them to feel the absence they had taken for granted. Long enough for Michael to confront, at last, the reality that his mother was no longer someone to be overlooked. In that quiet, I felt a strange sense of calm and power. Not the power to punish. Not the desire for revenge. Just the certainty that I had reclaimed my life. I had stopped disappearing. I had finally made space for myself in the story I had been living all these years. And as they finally spoke, hesitant, cautious, I understood that the reckoning I had been silently awaiting was beginning not with anger, but with awareness, and that awareness would soon open the door to things I had longed for: acknowledgement, closure, and the possibility of real change. A few days later, a video appeared online. It was Michael, sitting in a simple chair, in front of a messy bookshelf, his posture uncertain, his hands clasped together. No fancy lighting, no background music, just him and the truth he had been carrying for years. He began hesitantly, stumbling over words at first, but slowly gaining confidence. He spoke about me, the mother who had held up the pillars of his life when the world had turned its back. The woman who had nourished him, protected him, loved him in ways he had taken for granted. He admitted the truth. I had known all along. He had erased me from his life when it had suited him, choosing convenience over gratitude. He confessed that he hadn't expected forgiveness, that maybe he didn't even deserve it. But he understood. Finally, that recognition was not just deserved, it was long overdue. I watched the video quietly. The lights dimmed. The room still. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I simply felt a sense of relief. A lifting of weight I hadn't realized I had been carrying. For the first time in decades, I could breathe freely. Not because he had changed, but because I finally understood my own worth. It was strange to see him so small, so honest, speaking into a camera, realizing in his own time what he had overlooked. And I realized something: sometimes acknowledgement doesn't come in the way we expect. And sometimes the peace we seek comes from within, not from anyone else. And with that understanding, I was ready for the next step: my life, fully reclaimed, waiting beyond the doors I had long left closed. In the quiet of my new apartment, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside lay a single photograph of Michael when he was 5, hugging me tightly, his face pressed against my neck, grinning with missing baby teeth. Next to it, I placed the letter he had written later, admitting his mistakes, acknowledging the years he had taken for granted. I didn't keep it as a trophy, nor did I dwell on it as a wound. It was simply a part of the story, our story, and I no longer needed to carry the weight of being invisible. I realized then that anger and resentment had no place in the life I was building. Forgiveness wasn't required, but recognition of myself was essential. For the first time, I truly felt whole, grounded, and seen. I had learned that love shouldn't come at the cost of your own existence. That sometimes, stepping away, claiming your space, and embracing yourself is the most powerful act of all. And so, I live each day intentionally, honoring the sacrifices I made, the lessons I learned, and the person I have become. I don't need anyone else to validate my worth. I simply need to remember that my life, my choices, and my love matter because I exist, and I am enough. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to reflect on the ways you honor yourself in your relationships. Share your thoughts, leave a comment, or simply take a moment today to recognize your own strength. Your story matters too.